Hello and welcome to the Long Shadow. For generations, the history of England has begun in the wrong place. It begins with 1066, with William the Conqueror crossing the Channel, with the Battle of Hastings and the death of Harold with an arrow in his eye. But England did not begin in 1066. England already existed. Someone had to create it first. Someone had to take a shattered island of warring tribes and Viking invaders and forge it into a single nation. Someone whose name you have almost certainly never heard. On a blood-drenched morning in the year 937, that man stood on a battlefield surrounded by the largest enemy army Britain had ever seen. Vikings from the ports of Dublin, Scottish warriors from beyond the Forth, Welsh princes from the Western Mountains. 5 kings had united for a single purpose, to kill him and tear his kingdom apart. The battle would rage from the first light of dawn until darkness made fighting impossible. By sunset, the dead would lie so thick upon the ground that chroniclers claimed you could walk across the field without ever touching earth. If this king fell, there would be no England. The dream would die with him on that nameless field, in a location now so thoroughly lost that historians still argue over where it was. He did not fall. His name was Athelstan. And yet, ask anyone today to name the first king of England. You will be met with blank stares, with guesses, with silence. We remember Henry VIII and his wives. We remember Richard the Lionheart riding to Jerusalem. We remember the Tudor queens and the Stuart kings and every monarch who came after. But the man who made all of them possible, the man who created the very throne they sat upon, has been erased from our memory. This is the great injustice of English history. Athelstan united the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms when everyone believed it impossible. He defeated every enemy who rose against him. He built alliances that stretched from Norway to Burgundy. His contemporaries called him the most powerful ruler in all of Christendom. Foreign emperors sent ambassadors to beg for his favour. And today he is a ghost, forgotten by the nation he built with his own hands. Tonight we will resurrect him. We will follow his life from a birth so scandalous that men questioned whether he deserved to exist, through battles that decided the fate of nations, to a death that left behind a legacy that endures to this day. Before we begin this journey together, I would be grateful if you would take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. These small acts of support make it possible for me to continue telling these forgotten stories. I'm also curious, as always, to know where you are watching from tonight and what hour it is where you are. Leave a note in the comments. I read everyone. And now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to an age of burning monasteries, Viking longships, and the forging of a nation. But to understand the man who would become the first king of England, we must first understand the shattered world into which he was born. In the 9th century there was no England. The island of Britain was a fractured patchwork of rival kingdoms, each jealous of its independence, each suspicious of its neighbours. In the south lay Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, stretching from the chalky cliffs of the coast to the rolling hills of the interior. To its north lay Mercia, the great power of the Midlands, whose kings had once claimed supremacy over all the English-speaking peoples. In the east was East Anglia, a prosperous realm of fenlands and fertile fields. And far to the north, beyond the river Humber, lay Northumbria, a kingdom with a proud history of saints and scholars, whose monasteries held treasures of gold and learning. These 4 kingdoms spoke the same language. They worshipped the same Christian God. Their peoples shared a common ancestry, having migrated from the same Germanic homelands centuries before, and yet they warred constantly amongst themselves, their kings scheming and fighting, making alliances only to break them, seizing territory only to lose it again. The idea that these warring realms might one day unite under a single crown would have seemed absurd, And then came the Vikings. It began with a single raid. In the year 793, Scandinavian warriors descended upon the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast. They sacked the monastery, slaughtered the monks, and carried off the treasures that generations of the faithful had accumulated. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the horror: whirlwinds and lightning, fiery dragons seen flying through the sky, and then the heathen men who destroyed God's church with plunder and slaughter. At first these were seasonal raiders. They came in the summer months when the seas were calm, struck quickly, and vanished with their plunder before winter storms made the crossing dangerous. But over the decades the raids grew bolder, larger, and more frequent. Monasteries burned, towns were sacked, coastal communities lived in perpetual fear of the dragon-headed ships appearing on the horizon. Then, in the year 865, everything changed. A massive force landed on the shores of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxons called it the Great Heathen Army, and it had not come to raid. It had come to conquer. Led by the sons of the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok, this army began a systematic campaign of conquest. They moved with terrifying efficiency, exploiting the divisions between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, turning their rivalries against them. Within a decade they had achieved what had seemed impossible. One by one, the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell. East Anglia was conquered, its king martyred. Northumbria was shattered, its royal line extinguished. Mercia was reduced to a rump state, its eastern territories carved away and settled by Danish warriors. By the year 871, only one kingdom remained unconquered, and its young king was hiding in a swamp, hunted like an animal, with nothing left but his faith and his fury. His name was Alfred, and he was 22 years old when the weight of a dying kingdom fell upon his shoulders. He was never supposed to be king. He was the fifth son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, with 4 elder brothers standing between him and the throne. But one by one his brothers had died, some in battle, others from illness, each leaving the kingdom more battered than before. When his brother Ethelred fell in the spring of 871 after yet another desperate fight against the Danes, Alfred found himself the last of his line. He inherited not a kingdom, but a catastrophe. The early years of his reign were a nightmare of retreat and defeat. The Danes seemed unstoppable. Alfred bought time with payments of silver, with hollow treaties, with anything that might delay the final collapse. By the winter of 878, he had been driven from his own capital. With only a handful of loyal followers, he fled into the marshes of Somerset, hiding in the wetlands at a place called Athelney. It was here, according to the famous legend, that a peasant woman scolded him for letting her cakes burn, not knowing she was speaking to a king. Whether the story is true or not, it captures the desperate reality of his situation. The King of Wessex reduced to a hunted fugitive in the swamps. But Alfred did not surrender. In those dark months at Athelney, he gathered his strength, sent messages to the loyal thanes who still answered his call, and planned his counterstrike. When spring came, he emerged from the marshes and summoned the men of Wessex to meet him. They came. Despite everything, they came. And at a place called Eddington in May of 878, Alfred led his army against the Danish host and won a crushing victory. The Danish king Guthrum was forced to accept baptism and to withdraw his forces to the eastern territories. A formal boundary was established, dividing the island between the Anglo-Saxon lands and what came to be called the Danelaw, the regions where Danish law and custom prevailed. Wessex had survived, but Alfred understood that mere survival was not enough. In the years that followed, he transformed his kingdom. He reformed the army, creating a system of rotation that ensured warriors were always available for defence. He built a network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically placed to protect against future invasions. He created England's first real navy, designing ships longer and faster than the Viking longships. He promoted education, personally translating Latin texts into the English language, believing that a literate kingdom would be a stronger kingdom. But Alfred's greatest legacy was not a fortress or a fleet, it was a vision. He dreamed of a day when all the English-speaking peoples would be united under one crown, when the Danelaw would be reconquered, when the invaders would be driven out or absorbed. He knew he would not live to see it. He was already growing old, his health ravaged by a mysterious illness that had plagued him since youth. Alfred dreamed of a united English kingdom, but he knew he would not live to see it. Yet in his final years, according to later chroniclers, he looked upon one of his grandsons with particular interest, a boy whose very birth was shrouded in controversy, but whose destiny seemed somehow marked by providence. Around the year 894, in circumstances that later generations would hotly debate, a child was born who would change the course of history. His name was Athelstan, and from the moment of his birth, questions surrounded him. His father was Edward, the eldest surviving son of Alfred the Great, and heir to the throne of Wessex. This much is certain. But his mother was a woman named Ecgwin, and here the controversy begins. Later chroniclers, writing a century or more after the events, would call Ecgwin a concubine. Some described her as a shepherd's daughter, a woman of the lowest birth, entirely unsuitable to be the mother of a king. William of Malmesbury, the great 12th century historian who had become Athelstan's most devoted biographer, felt compelled to defend his subject's legitimacy, suggesting that Ecgwin was indeed Edward's lawful first wife, whose memory had been deliberately obscured. The truth is lost to time. What seems clear is that Ecgwin's status was ambiguous enough to cause problems. Edward would later marry again, first to a noble woman named Elflaed, then to another named Eadgifu. These later wives came from powerful families. Their sons were born firmly within the legitimacy of recognised royal marriage, but Athelstan, the firstborn, would always carry the shadow of his mother's uncertain position. In the hierarchical world of early medieval England, such things mattered enormously. A king's authority rested not just on his ability to fight and to govern, but on his bloodline, on the unquestioned legitimacy of his claim. A child born of a concubine, or even of a marriage that powerful men chose not to recognise, was vulnerable. He could be challenged, he could be set aside. His very existence could be treated as an embarrassment. Throughout his life, Athelstan would face whispered doubts about his right to rule. His half-brothers, born to more respectable mothers, would have their supporters. The circumstances of his birth meant that nothing would ever be simply given to him. Every achievement would have to be earned. Every claim would have to be proven. Where another prince might have relied on the unquestioned prestige of royal blood, Athelstan would have to demonstrate again and again that he was worthy of the crown. This could have broken him. A lesser child might have been crushed by the weight of such doubt, might have accepted a subordinate role, might have faded into obscurity as so many inconvenient royal children did. But Athelstan was not a lesser child. In a world where royal legitimacy meant everything, young Athelstan bore the stain of questionable birth. He might have been forgotten, discarded, pushed aside in favour of his more legitimate half-brothers. But his grandfather, the great Alfred himself, saw something in this boy that others had missed. The old king was dying. Alfred the Great, the man who had saved the English from annihilation, was in his final years. His health, never robust, was failing. The mysterious illness that had plagued him for decades was finally claiming its victory. But there was still work to be done, legacies to secure and a dynasty to establish. According to William of Malmesbury, writing more than 200 years later, but drawing on traditions preserved at the monasteries Alfred had patronised, the ageing king summoned his young grandson to court. Athelstan was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, barely more than a toddler, yet Alfred saw fit to honour him with a ceremony that would echo through the centuries. Before the assembled nobles of Wessex, the great men who governed the kingdom and commanded its armies, Alfred invested the child with the trappings of a warrior. He draped a scarlet cloak around the boy's small shoulders, a garment of royal purple-red, the colour of kings. He fastened around his waist a belt set with precious gems, gleaming in the torchlight of the great hall, and then, most significantly of all, he presented the child with a Saxon sword in a scabbard of beaten gold. A sword for a child who could barely lift it. A weapon of war for a boy who had never seen battle. But the meaning was unmistakable. In the symbolic language of the age, Alfred was marking this grandson for greatness. He was signalling to his court that this boy, despite the questions surrounding his birth, was worthy of notice. He was planting a seed that might one day grow into a claim to kingship itself. Did the ceremony happen exactly as William of Malmesbury described it? Scholars have debated this for centuries. William was writing long after the event, in an age that loved to embellish the deeds of great men. He may have elaborated, may have added details for dramatic effect, may have polished a simpler truth into something more glittering. But even if the specific details are uncertain, the underlying reality seems sound. Alfred did take a special interest in this particular grandson. He did single him out from among his other grandchildren. Something set Athelstan apart even in his earliest years. Perhaps Alfred recognised a quality in the boy, some spark of intelligence or determination that marked him as exceptional. Perhaps he saw in Athelstan's situation the firstborn son fighting against the disadvantage of questionable birth, an echo of his own unlikely rise to power. After all, Alfred himself had been the 5th son, never expected to rule, thrust onto the throne by the deaths of his brothers. He knew what it meant to prove oneself against the odds. Whatever his reasons, Alfred's blessing would prove prophetic. The child with the golden sword would one day wield real power over all the English-speaking peoples. The old king, who had saved his people from destruction, placed his hopes in a child who was barely old enough to hold a sword. Just a few years later, in the autumn of 899, Alfred the Great was dead. His dream would now pass to his son Edward, and the boy with the golden sword would have to wait and watch and grow strong in the shadows. On the 26th of October, in the year 899, Alfred the Great breathed his last. He was approximately 50 years old, ancient by the standards of an age when kings died young on battlefields, and common people rarely saw their 40th year. He had reigned for 28 years, transforming Wessex from a kingdom on the brink of annihilation into the most powerful state in Britain. The monks who recorded his passing mourned him as a father of his people, a scholar king who had loved learning as much as warfare. The succession passed smoothly to his son Edward, who would come to be known as Edward the Elder. At around 30 years of age, Edward was a proven warrior who had fought beside his father in numerous campaigns. He had been groomed for kingship and was ready to continue the work of reconquest that Alfred had begun. The nobles of Wessex accepted him without serious challenge, but young Athelstan, now perhaps 5 or 6 years old, was not kept at his father's court. In the months following Alfred's death, the child was sent away from Wessex entirely. His destination was the neighbouring kingdom of Mercia, where he would be raised in the household of his aunt Ethelflede and her husband Ethelred, the lord of the Mercians. This arrangement has puzzled historians. Why would Edward send away his firstborn son? Why place him in a different kingdom entirely, separated from the centre of West Saxon power? The sources, frustratingly silent on Edward's motivations, leave us to speculate. One possibility is that it was an act of political calculation. designed to marginalise a son whose questionable birth made him inconvenient. Edward would soon marry again, producing sons whose legitimacy was unquestioned. Keeping Athelstan at a distance would prevent him from building a power base at the West Saxon court, would keep him from the eyes of nobles who might support his claim against his half-brothers. But there is another possibility, one that casts Edward's decision in a different light. Mercia was no backwater exile. It was a proud kingdom with its own warrior traditions, its own nobility, its own strategic importance in the wars against the Danes. By placing Athelstan there, Edward might have been grooming him for a different kind of role, not as King of Wessex, but as a ruler who could one day command the loyalty of Mercians as well as West Saxons. To the casual observer, sending Athelstan away might have looked like sidelining an inconvenient child. But those who understood the politics of 9th century Britain knew that Mercia was no backwater. It was a kingdom with its own proud traditions, its own warriors, and its own formidable ruler, a woman unlike any other in the age of the Vikings. Her name was Aethelflaed, and she was Alfred the Great's eldest daughter. In an age when women were expected to be silent partners in the ambitions of men, she became a warrior, a strategist, and a ruler whose power rivaled that of any king. She had been married young to Aethelred, the lord of the Mercians, in a union designed to seal the alliance between Wessex and its northern neighbour. The marriage had served its political purpose, binding the two kingdoms together against their common Viking enemies. But Aethelflaed was no passive diplomatic pawn. From the beginning she was her husband's partner in governance and in war. When Aethelred's health began to fail in the early years of the 10th century, likely from wounds or illness contracted during the endless fighting, Aethelflaed stepped forward. She did not merely maintain the household while her husband recovered. She took on the responsibilities of rulership itself, commanding the Mercian forces, directing the construction of fortifications, negotiating with allies and enemies alike. When Aethelred finally died in 911, there was no question of Aethelflaed stepping aside. The Mercian nobles acclaimed her as their leader. She took the title Lady of the Mercians, a carefully chosen formulation that acknowledged she was not technically a queen, while making clear that she wielded queenly power. For the next 7 years, she would rule Mercia in her own right. Her accomplishments were extraordinary. She built fortresses across the Mercian frontier, creating a defensive network that strangled Viking-held territories. She led armies in the field, personally directing campaigns against Danish strongholds. In 917, her forces captured Derby, one of the 5 great Danish boroughs. The following year, the Vikings of Leicester submitted to her authority without a fight, so fearsome was her reputation. She worked in close coordination with her brother Edward, the two of them executing a brilliant pincer strategy against the Danelaw. While Edward pushed up from the south, Aethelflaed pressed down from the north. Together they achieved conquest that their father could only have dreamed of. This was the woman into whose household young Athelstan was delivered. This was the warrior queen who would raise him, shape him, and prepare him for the throne that awaited. The chroniclers do not record the details of daily life in Aethelflaed's court, but we can imagine the education that Athelstan received there. He would have watched his aunt command the loyalty of proud Mercian warriors who followed her not because they had to, but because they believed in her. He would have learned that power came not merely from birth, but from demonstrated competence, from the ability to lead men and to make difficult decisions. He would have seen a woman exercise authority in a world dominated by men, breaking every expectation of what a woman could achieve. Under Aethelflaed's tutelage, Athelstan learned not just the arts of war, but the arts of governance, how to command loyalty from proud Mercian nobles, how to build fortresses, how to think strategically. She was preparing him for something, and in the great hall of her court, surrounded by Mercian warriors who owed him nothing by blood, the boy began to become a king. For nearly 2 decades, from approximately 899 to 918, Athelstan grew to manhood in the halls of Mercia. These were the formative years, the years that would shape the king he would become, and they gave him something that no other ruler of his dynasty had possessed: a true understanding of both halves of what would one day be England. His education was comprehensive. Like all princes of his age, he was trained in the arts of war. He learned to ride a horse, to fight with sword and shield, to stand in the brutal formation of the shield wall where battles were won or lost in grinding face-to-face combat. The Mercians were renowned warriors, proud of their military traditions, and they would have ensured that Alfred's grandson could hold his own among fighting men. But Athelstan's education went far beyond the training ground. The household of Aethelflaed and Aethelred was a centre of learning as well as war. Following the tradition established by Alfred the Great, who had believed passionately in education, the Mercian court maintained scholars and books. Athelstan learned Latin, the language of the church and of international diplomacy. He studied scripture and theology. He developed a love of learning that would mark his entire reign. He also learned to collect. Among the treasures of the Mercian court were holy relics, fragments of saints, and sacred objects that were believed to carry divine power. Athelstan developed what would become a lifelong passion for acquiring such objects, a pursuit that was partly religious devotion and partly political strategy. In an age when kingdoms were held together by faith as much as by force, the king who possessed the holiest relics commanded spiritual authority. Most importantly, Athelstan learned to be Mercian. He was not merely a West Saxon prince stationed in a foreign court. He was raised among the Mercians, trained by their warriors, educated by their scholars, surrounded by their customs and traditions. When he spoke as one of them. When he judged disputes, he understood Mercian law and Mercian sensibilities. The nobles of Mercia came to see him not as a hostage or a stranger, but as their own. This dual identity would prove to be his greatest political asset. Previous kings had tried to unite the Anglo-Saxon peoples through conquest alone, forcing submission through military power. But Athelstan would be able to claim a legitimacy that transcended force. He was, by birth, a prince of Wessex, descended from Alfred and from the ancient West Saxon royal line. But he was, by upbringing, also a Mercian, formed in the traditions of that proud kingdom. He could speak to both peoples as one of their own. While Athelstan grew to manhood in Mercia, his father Edward was waging a relentless war of reconquest. Year by year, fortress by fortress, he and Aethelflaed pushed the Vikings back, and then, in the summer of 918, the Lady of the Mercians suddenly died. The world Athelstan had known was about to change forever. On the 12th of June, in the year 918, Aethelflaed drew her last breath at Tamworth, the ancient capital of the Mercian kings. She was approximately 50 years old, and had spent the last 7 years as the sole ruler of her kingdom. Just days before, she had achieved one of her greatest triumphs. The Vikings of Leicester had surrendered to her authority without a fight, cowed by her reputation and her approaching army. She died at the height of her power, with her life's work nearly complete. The chroniclers recorded her passing with respect bordering on awe. Even writers from Wessex, who might have been expected to downplay the achievements of a rival kingdom's ruler, acknowledged her extraordinary accomplishments. She had built fortresses, led armies, conquered Danish territories, and maintained the alliance with her brother that had made all of it possible. She had proven that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. Aethelflaed left behind a daughter named Elfwin, now a young woman in her own right. The Mercian nobles acclaimed Elfwin as their new lady, following the precedent her mother had established. For a brief moment it seemed that Mercia might continue under its own native dynasty, ruled by the women of Alfred's line. But Edward the Elder had other plans. Within months of Aethelflaed's death, Edward marched into Mercia. He came not as an enemy, but as a brother and uncle, claiming to restore order and protect his niece. But his actions told a different story. He stripped Aelfwine of her position and, according to the laconic entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, deprived her of all authority in Mercia and took her into Wessex. She was essentially kidnapped, removed from her kingdom and placed under her uncle's control. She vanishes from history after this moment, her fate unknown. With Aelfwine removed, Edward absorbed Mercia into his own realm. The proud kingdom that had maintained its independence even through the worst of the Viking wars was now subordinate to Wessex. The Mercian nobles were forced to accept West Saxon overlordship. The alliance between the two kingdoms was transformed into direct rule. For Athelstan, now in his mid-20s, the implications were profound. The woman who had raised him was dead. The kingdom that had been his home was now under his father's direct control. His status, always ambiguous, became even more uncertain. Was he still the favoured grandson of Alfred? Or was he now simply one of Edward's sons, and not even the most legitimate one? The woman who had raised Athelstan as her own was gone. The kingdom that had been his home was now absorbed into his father's realm. And somewhere in the shadows, his half-brothers, born to Edward's later, more legitimate wives, were growing up at the heart of the West Saxon court, closer to their father and closer to the throne. For a quarter of a century, Edward the Elder waged relentless war. He was not a king who sought peace or compromise. He sought conquest, the fulfilment of his father's dream, the destruction of Danish power in Britain. Building on the foundations Alfred had laid, Edward and his sister Aethelflaed had developed a devastating strategy. They constructed fortified towns, burhs, in a systematic pattern that slowly strangled the Viking territories. Each new fortress was placed within a day's march of the last, creating an interlocking defensive network that could not be bypassed. Behind these walls, English settlers moved into reclaimed land, farming and trading, making permanent what had been won by force. The campaign moved with methodical precision. In 912, Edward built fortresses at Hertford and Witham, securing the eastern approaches. In 914 he took Bedford. In 917 his forces captured Towcester and conquered the Danish armies at Tempsford, killing their king in the battle. One by one, the great Danish boroughs fell. Northampton, Cambridge, Huntingdon, Colchester, Stamford, Nottingham. By the time of Aethelflaed's death in 918, the southern Danelaw had been effectively conquered. The descendants of the great heathen army who had once terrorised the English kingdoms were now subjects of the West Saxon crown. They were not expelled or exterminated. Edward was pragmatic enough to accept their submission and integrate them into his expanding realm. But there was no question of who held power. Only one great prize remained unconquered: Northumbria, the ancient kingdom in the north, with its capital at the Roman city of York, was still ruled by Viking kings. These were not descendants of the great heathen army, but later arrivals connected to the powerful Norse kingdoms of Ireland and Scotland. They commanded a formidable realm, wealthy from trade, protected by distance, and linked by blood and alliance to Viking powers across the sea. In the summer of 920, Edward led his army northward in a demonstration of force. The Welsh princes had already submitted to him, acknowledging his overlordship. Now the northern powers were forced to do the same. Constantine, king of the Scots, recognised Edward as father and lord. The Viking rulers of York, the king of Strathclyde, and the English lords of Bamberg all made their submission. For the first time, a single ruler was acknowledged as overlord of virtually all the peoples of Britain. Edward had achieved more than any English king before him. He had conquered the southern Danelaw, absorbed Mercia, and received the submission of the northern kingdoms. His realm stretched from the English Channel to the borders of Scotland. He was at the height of his power. By 924, Edward the Elder had conquered more territory than any English king before him. He was master of all southern Britain, acknowledged as overlord by the Welsh princes and even by the Scots. He was at the height of his power. And then, suddenly, on the 17th of July, 924, he was dead, and the succession he left behind was anything but clear. The king was suppressing a rebellion when death found him. In the summer of 924, Edward the Elder marched his army to the Welsh border. A combined force of Mercians and Welsh had risen against his authority at a place called Chester, challenging the unity he had spent decades building. This was the work of kings, stamping out resistance, reminding subjects of the price of defiance. Edward had done it countless times before. He arrived at Farndon-on-Dee, established his position, and crushed the rebellion with the same ruthless efficiency that had dismantled the Danelaw. And then, on the 17th of July, 924, he collapsed and died. He was approximately 50 years old. He had reigned for a quarter of a century. He had conquered more territory than any English king before him, absorbing Mercia, shattering the Danish boroughs, receiving the submission of Welsh and Scottish kings. Just days before his death, he'd been directing military operations with the energy that had defined his entire reign. There was no warning, no lingering illness, no time for preparation. One moment he was a king at the height of his power. The next moment he was a corpse. The succession crisis began immediately. Edward had married multiple times, and each marriage had produced sons with competing claims. His first wife, Ecgwin, the woman of mysterious status, had given him Athelstan, now a man in his late 20s who had spent his entire adult life in Mercia. His second wife, Elflade, had given him Elfweird, a younger son who had been raised at the heart of the West Saxon court. His third wife, Edgifu, had given him even younger sons, Edmund and Edred, still children but representing yet another faction with ambitions of their own. The nobles of Wessex had never truly accepted Athelstan. He was a stranger to them, raised in a foreign court, tainted by the rumours of his mother's low birth. Elfweird, by contrast, was one of their own. He had grown up among them, was connected to them through his mother's powerful family, and represented the continuation of West Saxon tradition untainted by Mercian influence. Within days of Edward's death, the kingdom began to fracture along these lines. The West Saxon nobles proclaimed Elfweird as their king. The Mercians, remembering the prince who had been raised in their halls, rallied to Athelstan. Two sons of the same father, each crowned by their respective supporters, each backed by powerful factions with everything to lose. The island that Edward had spent his life unifying was suddenly staring into the abyss of civil war. Armies would have to march, blood would have to flow, brothers would have to kill brothers, two claims, two factions. The West Saxons rallied to Elfweird, the son raised among them. The Mercians rallied to Athelstan, the prince who had grown up in their halls. It seemed certain that blood would be spilled, but fate intervened in the most brutal and unexpected way. 16 days. That was all that separated Edward's death from the resolution of the succession crisis. But the manner of that resolution has troubled historians for over 1,000 years. Elfweird, the West Saxon claimant, the young prince who stood between Athelstan and undisputed power, died around the 2nd of August 924. He'd been king of Wessex for barely more than 2 weeks. Some sources say he died at Oxford. Others offer no location at all. None of them explain why a healthy young man in his prime suddenly ceased to breathe. Was it illness? The summer months brought fevers and plagues. and even kings were not immune to the invisible killers that swept through communities without warning. Was it an accident? The life of a young nobleman was filled with dangers: hunting, riding, training for war. A fall from a horse, a wound that turned foul, a blow to the head that seemed minor but proved fatal. Was it poison? The convenient removal of a rival at the precise moment when his existence threatened civil war is the sort of coincidence that makes suspicious minds reach for darker explanations. We will never know. The chroniclers, usually so careful to record the deaths of kings, are strangely silent on the details. They note that Alfred died. They note that he was buried at Winchester, the royal mausoleum of the West Saxon kings. And then they move on, as if eager to leave this uncomfortable episode behind. What we do know is that Alfred's death transformed the political landscape. The West Saxon faction had lost its candidate. There was no longer a legitimate alternative around whom opposition to Athelstan could rally. The path to the throne, which had seemed blocked by the wall of West Saxon resistance, was suddenly open. But open is not the same as clear. The nobles who had opposed Athelstan did not simply vanish with their candidate's death. Their suspicions remained. Their resentment of this Mercian-raised prince with his questionable mother remained. Their fear that he would favour Mercian interests over West Saxon traditions remained. They could no longer prevent him from becoming king, but they could delay. They could negotiate. They could extract promises and concessions, and delay they did. More than a year would pass between Edward's death and Athelstan's coronation. 14 months of manoeuvring, of bargaining, of slowly wearing down resistance. 14 months during which Athelstan was king in name, but still fighting for acceptance in fact. With Alfred dead, the path to the throne was clearer, but not yet clear. The West Saxon nobles who had opposed Athelstan did not simply melt away. Their resistance would delay his coronation for over a year, and even when the crown was finally placed upon his head, whispers of illegitimacy would follow him for the rest of his life. On the 4th of September, in the year 925, the waiting finally ended. The ceremony took place at Kingston upon Thames, the ancient coronation site where Anglo-Saxon kings had been made for generations. The location was significant. Kingston sat at a crossing point of the Thames, on the boundary between Wessex and the territories that had once been Mercian and Danish. It was neutral ground, a place where a king could claim authority over all his peoples without favouring one over another. The great men of the realm assembled to witness the moment. Nobles from Wessex who had resisted Athelstan for 14 months now stood beside Mercian lords who had supported him from the beginning. Bishops and abbots came from every corner of the kingdom, bringing with them the spiritual authority of the church. Foreign ambassadors watched from positions of honour, ready to carry word of the new king back to their masters across the sea. The ceremony itself was a masterwork of political theatre. Athelstan was anointed with holy oil by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the sacred chrism that transformed a mortal man into God's chosen vessel. This was not merely a political coronation, it was a religious consecration, a statement that Athelstan's right to rule came not from his questionable bloodline, but from divine selection. Whatever men might whisper about his mother, God himself had marked him as king. The archbishop placed a crown upon his head. A ring was slid onto his finger, symbol of his marriage to the kingdom. A sword was girded at his waist, reminder that a king must defend his people. A sceptre was pressed into his hand, emblem of royal authority. With each piece of regalia the transformation was completed. The boy of questionable birth, the prince raised in exile, the man who had waited and watched while others claimed what should have been his, was now undeniably and irrevocably the king. He was approximately 30 years old. He had waited his entire life for this moment, and he knew, even as the cheers echoed through the hall at Kingston, that his work was only beginning. The kingdom he inherited was vast by the standards of his predecessors, but it was not yet England. Wessex and Mercia were unified under his rule. The southern Danelaw had been absorbed. The Welsh princes acknowledged his overlordship, but to the north, beyond the river Humber, the ancient kingdom of Northumbria remained in Viking hands. The city of York, the greatest prize in the north, flew the banner of a Norse king. Athelstan sat upon his throne, anointed and crowned. But he knew that his kingdom was incomplete. To the north, beyond the Humber River, the Vikings still ruled from the ancient city of York. Their king, a fierce warrior named Sitric, commanded a powerful realm. If Athelstan wished to fulfill his grandfather's dream, he would have to deal with the men of the north. He began not with war, but with a wedding. His name was Sitric Keech, and he was everything Athelstan was not. Where Athelstan was learned and pious, raised among books and monks, Sitric was a warrior who had carved his kingdom out of blood and iron. Where Athelstan had spent his youth waiting in the shadows, Sitric had spent his fighting across the Irish Sea, battling rival Viking lords for control of the rich trading towns of Ireland. He had seized the throne of York in 921, driving out his rivals and establishing himself as master of the last great Viking kingdom in Britain. Northumbria under Sitric was a formidable realm. York itself was one of the wealthiest cities in the British Isles, a commercial hub where Scandinavian traders exchanged goods with merchants from across the known world. The kingdom commanded the rich farmlands of Yorkshire and controlled the strategic routes between north and south. Its warriors were veterans of countless battles, hardened by the brutal conflicts of the Viking world. More dangerous still were Sitric's connections. The Viking kingdoms of Britain were not isolated outposts. They were nodes in a vast network of Norse power that stretched from Dublin to the Orkney Islands, from the Hebrides to the fjords of Norway. Sitric had kinsmen and allies across this network. An attack on York might bring fleets from Ireland sailing up the Humber. It might provoke the Norse lords of Scotland into joining the fight. A war for Northumbria could easily become a war against the entire Viking world. Athelstan understood these realities. He was not a reckless glory-seeker who would throw his army against the walls of York regardless of the cost. He was a calculating strategist who weighed risks and opportunities with careful precision. Direct conquest was possible, but it would be bloody, uncertain, and might destabilize the kingdom he had only just secured. There was another path. Athelstan had something that Sitric needed: legitimacy. For all his military power, Sitric was an outsider in Britain, a foreign warlord ruling over a population that still remembered Christian Northumbrian kings. An alliance with the most powerful ruler south of the Humber would strengthen his position, protect his borders, and give him standing among the established powers of the island. In the year 926 the deal was struck. Athelstan gave one of his half-sisters in marriage to Sitric. In exchange, the Viking king accepted baptism into the Christian faith and acknowledged a relationship of peace with his new brother-in-law. It was diplomacy at its most cold-blooded. A woman exchanged for stability, a marriage bed traded for a secure border. The marriage alliance was a masterstroke of diplomacy. With Sitric bound to him by marriage, Athelstan could secure his northern border and focus on consolidating his realm. But fate had other plans. Less than a year after the wedding, Sitric was dead, and the agreement that had kept the peace died with him. Sitric Keech died in the year 927. The chronicles do not say how or why. He was not an old man. He had been vigorous enough to fight for his throne, to take a new bride, to rule his turbulent kingdom with an iron hand. And then he was simply gone. His death plunged Northumbria into immediate chaos. He had sons from an earlier marriage, but none were positioned to take power smoothly. The eldest, Olaf, was forced to flee across the sea to the Viking stronghold of Dublin, where he would nurse his grievances and wait for an opportunity to reclaim his inheritance. Sihtric's brother Guthfrith made a desperate attempt to seize the throne of York, hoping to keep the kingdom in the family. Athelstan did not wait to see how the succession crisis would resolve itself. He had learned from his own long wait for power that hesitation was fatal. Before Guthfrith could consolidate his position, before Olaf could return with an army from Ireland, before the other Viking lords of the north could decide where their loyalties lay, Athelstan struck. His army marched north with stunning speed. This was not a tentative probe or a diplomatic mission backed by force. This was a full-scale invasion, a campaign of conquest that would settle the question of Northumbria once and for all. The forces Athelstan commanded were overwhelming. The years of patient consolidation in the south had built him an army that no single Viking lord could hope to match. Guthfrith faced an impossible choice. He could fight and almost certainly die, his warriors slaughtered, his ambitions crushed. Or he could run, preserving his life and perhaps the chance for revenge another day. He chose to run, fleeing to Scotland and throwing himself on the mercy of King Constantine. The city of York opened its gates without a siege. The Danish jarls and Norse warriors who had ruled the north for generations submitted to the southern king. For the first time since the Vikings had conquered it 2 generations earlier, the ancient Roman city of Eboracum, the Christian capital of Northumbria that had produced some of the greatest scholars of the early medieval world, was under the rule of an English king. It was a conquest that remade the map of Britain. But Athelstan understood that maps could be redrawn just as quickly as they were drawn. The north was not truly conquered until it was truly pacified. The men who had submitted to him this summer might rebel next spring if they sensed weakness. Athelstan had taken York, but holding it would require more than military force. The north was a different world, Scandinavian in culture, suspicious of southern rule, and connected by blood and commerce to powerful Viking kingdoms across the sea. To secure his conquest, Athelstan needed the recognition of every ruler in Britain, and he was about to get it. On the 12th of July in the year 927, the kings of Britain gathered at a place called Eamont Bridge, near the modern border between England and Scotland. What happened there that summer day had never happened before in the history of the island. Athelstan came as the conqueror of Northumbria, his army encamped nearby, his power undeniable. But he came also as something more, a king seeking to transform military dominance into political legitimacy. He did not simply want the other rulers of Britain to fear him. He wanted them to acknowledge him, publicly and formally, as their overlord. They came. Constantine II, King of the Scots, whose realm stretched from the Forth to the distant northern islands. Hywel King of Deheubarth, the most powerful of the Welsh princes, whose influence extended across much of Wales. Eldred, Lord of Bamburgh, who ruled the English population of northern Northumbria that had never fully submitted to Viking control. Owain, King of Strathclyde, whose British kingdom occupied the lands around the Clyde. One by one, these proud rulers acknowledged Athelstan as their superior. The precise words they spoke are lost, but the meaning was unmistakable. They pledged to keep the peace. They renounced alliances with Athelstan's enemies. They accepted for themselves and their successors a position subordinate to the king of the English. For Constantine, this submission must have been bitter. He was an old king, veteran of decades of warfare, ruler of a kingdom with its own ancient traditions. To kneel before a man young enough to be his son, to accept the overlordship of a dynasty that had been hiding in swamps when his ancestors ruled from Edinburgh, was a humiliation that would not be forgotten. But he had sheltered Guthfrith after the fall of York, and Athelstan had made clear that defiance would be met with war. Prudence demanded submission. Pride demanded patience. For Athelstan, the gathering at Eamont was the culmination of everything his family had worked toward. His grandfather Alfred had dreamed of uniting the English and driving out the Vikings. His father Edward had conquered the Danelaw and absorbed Mercia. Now Athelstan had completed the work. He ruled not just Wessex or even just England, but exercised acknowledged supremacy over the entire island of Britain. No previous ruler had achieved this. Not the Roman emperors who had occupied the southern portions of the island, not the legendary kings of the Britons, not the mighty Mercian overlords of previous centuries. Athelstan stood alone, paramount over all. Athelstan stood at Eamont Bridge as the paramount ruler of Britain, a position no king before him had achieved. But submission given is not submission kept. The kings who knelt before him that summer day were proud men with long memories. They had yielded to his power, not his legitimacy, and they were already watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. The titles tell the story. In the early years of his reign, Athelstan's charters called him King of the Anglo-Saxons, the same modest title his father and grandfather had used. But after Eamont, after the conquest of York and the submission of the northern kings, the language changed. He became King of the English, a title that implied rule over all the English-speaking peoples, not just those of Wessex. Then he became King of all Britain, claiming sovereignty over the Scots and Welsh who had knelt before him. His coinage carried Latin inscriptions that pushed even further. Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. These were not empty boasts. For the first time in the island's history, a single legal and administrative system began to extend across territories that had previously been governed by separate laws and customs. Athelstan issued law codes that applied to all his subjects, whether they lived in ancient Wessex or newly conquered Northumbria. He established standardized weights and measures for trade. He demanded that every man in his kingdom have a lord who would be responsible for his behaviour, creating chains of obligation that bound the entire society together. His court became a gathering place for the great men of Britain. Welsh princes sat beside English earls. Scandinavian lords from the newly submitted north mingled with West Saxon nobles whose families had served Athelstan's grandfather. Foreign dignitaries arrived bearing gifts and seeking alliances. The king's household became a school where the sons of nobles from across the realm were educated together, building personal bonds that would transcend regional loyalties. The machinery of a unified state began to take shape. Royal officials travelled the kingdom enforcing the king's law and collecting the king's taxes. A network of mints produced coins bearing Athelstan's image and titles, spreading his name into every marketplace and every purse. Written documents, produced by an increasingly sophisticated chancery, recorded grants of land and privileges in language that emphasised the king's universal authority. What Athelstan was building had never existed before. The Roman province of Britannia had been an administrative unit of a foreign empire, not a native kingdom. The earlier English kingdoms had been rivals, not components of a single state. Even his father's conquests had been held together primarily by military force rather than shared institutions. Athelstan was creating something new, an English kingdom with a sense of itself as a unified nation. The name Englaland, Land of the English, began to appear in documents. The idea that all English-speaking peoples belonged together, despite their different regional origins, started to take root. The boundaries he established, the institutions he created, the very concept of England itself, would endure long after his death. Athelstan had united the English and received the submission of the Britons and Scots, but he understood that true power required more than military dominance. To secure his dynasty's future, he needed allies beyond his island, and he had something valuable to offer: the hands of his many half-sisters. Athelstan possessed an unusual asset for a king, an abundance of sisters. Edward the Elder's multiple marriages had produced daughters as well as sons, and these women became the instruments of Athelstan's foreign policy. With cold calculation and strategic brilliance, He married them off to the most powerful rulers in Europe, building a web of alliances that transformed England from an obscure island kingdom into a major player in continental politics. The most significant match was that of his half-sister Edgith, who was sent across the sea to marry Otto, the Duke of Saxony. Otto was no minor German prince. He was the most powerful lord in the fragmented landscape of post-Carolingian Germany, and he would eventually become Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, founder of a dynasty that would dominate Central Europe for generations. Through this single marriage, Athelstan tied his bloodline to the imperial throne itself. Another half-sister, Edhild, was given to Hugh the Great, Duke of the Franks. Hugh was not a king, but he was the power behind the tottering Carolingian throne, the man who effectively controlled the wealthy heartland of what had been Charlemagne's empire. His son would become Hugh Capet, founder of the dynasty that would rule France for 8 centuries. Through Edhild, English blood would flow into the Capetian line. Other sisters were dispatched to other thrones. One married Conrad, King of Burgundy, whose realm controlled the crucial Alpine passes between Italy and northern Europe. Another was sent to Louis, a Carolingian prince of Aquitaine. The web of connections spread across the continent, linking the English court to every major power centre in Western Christendom. The flow was not one-directional. Foreign princes recognised Athelstan's power and sought his alliance in return. The future King Louis IV of France was raised at Athelstan's court after being exiled from his homeland, growing up among English nobles before returning to claim his throne. Alan of Brittany, driven from his lands by Viking invaders, found refuge with Athelstan, who would later help him reclaim his duchy. Haakon, son of Harold Fairhair of Norway, was fostered at the English court, creating bonds that stretched even to the Scandinavian world. The gifts that accompanied these diplomatic exchanges were magnificent. Foreign rulers sent Athelstan holy relics, precious manuscripts, weapons of legendary craftsmanship. A sword said to have belonged to the Emperor Constantine arrived from the continent. Fragments of the True Cross and other sacred objects flowed into England, feeding Athelstan's famous passion for collecting. Through marriages and alliances, Athelstan had positioned England at the centre of a European network of power. Athelstan's sisters carried English blood to the thrones of Europe. His nephews would become emperors and kings. But there was one conspicuous absence in this web of marriage alliances: Athelstan himself. He never married. He never produced an heir. Why the first King of England chose to die childless remains one of the great mysteries of his reign. In an age when kings were expected to marry young and produce heirs in abundance, Athelstan remained alone. He was not a man without prospects. The chroniclers describe him as tall and handsome, with hair that shone like flax, a king of commanding presence and considerable personal charm. He was wealthy beyond measure, ruling the most powerful kingdom in Britain, and allied by marriage to the greatest houses of Europe. Any princess in Christendom would have been honoured to share his throne, and yet he never took a wife. The sources offer hints but no explanations. Later legends, written centuries after his death, claim that Athelstan had taken a vow of chastity, dedicating himself to God with the same intensity he dedicated himself to his kingdom. William of Malmesbury, his most devoted biographer, wrote admiringly of his purity and self-control. But these accounts were written by monks who valued celibacy, and may have been projecting their own ideals onto a king they admired. Other explanations are possible. Marriage in Athelstan's world was never merely personal. It was always political, always a statement about alliances and factions. To marry a West Saxon noblewoman would have favoured the nobles of Wessex over those of Mercia. To marry a Mercian would have done the opposite. To marry a foreign princess would have created obligations to a foreign power. Perhaps Athelstan concluded that any marriage would create more problems than it solved, that remaining above the factions served his interest better than joining one. There's also the question of his half-brothers. Edmund and Edred, the sons of Edward's third wife Edgifu, were young but healthy. If Athelstan died without children, the throne would pass to them, keeping power within the family. A son of Athelstan would have displaced them, potentially creating the same kind of succession conflict that had nearly torn the kingdom apart after Edward's death. By remaining childless, Athelstan may have been ensuring a smooth transition to the next generation. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and more personal. Perhaps Athelstan simply had no desire for marriage. Perhaps the passions that drove other men toward wives and heirs were absent in him, replaced by other obsessions, books and learning, relics and saints, the building of a kingdom and the crafting of laws. The sources do not tell us. They record what he did, not what he felt. What we know is that he spent his life as he ended it, alone in the midst of his court, surrounded by nobles and petitioners, but sharing his throne with no one. The king who gave away his sisters in marriage never knew a marriage of his own. But whatever Athelstan lacked in domestic life, he more than compensated for in his passions, for books, for holy relics, and for the pursuit of justice. The treasures poured into England from every corner of Christendom. Athelstan was a collector with an insatiable appetite, and his passion focused on two categories of objects: holy relics and learned manuscripts. In both pursuits, he displayed the same systematic determination that had driven his conquest of Northumbria and his construction of European alliances. He gathered sacred and intellectual treasures as deliberately as he gathered power. The relics were spectacular. From continental monasteries and from the shrines of Rome itself, fragments of the sacred past flowed toward the English king. Pieces of the true cross upon which Christ had died, a portion of the crown of thorns that had pierced his brow, fragments of the manger from Bethlehem, a piece of the stone upon which Jesus had stood during his ascension. The sword of Constantine the Great, the lance of Charlemagne, bones and cloths and sacred objects associated with countless saints. To modern sensibilities, this collection might seem macabre or superstitious. But in Athelstan's world, relics were concentrated holiness, points where the divine touched the material world. A king who possessed powerful relics possessed channels of miraculous grace. His prayers would be heard, his kingdom would be protected, his enemies would face not just his army, but the wrath of the saints whose remains he guarded. Athelstan did not hoard these treasures. He distributed them strategically throughout his kingdom, gifting relics to churches and monasteries in every region. Each gift bound the recipient institution to the crown through ties of gratitude and obligation. Each created a new centre of sacred power that owed its treasure to the king's generosity. It was piety and politics woven inseparably together. His collection of manuscripts was equally impressive. Books in the early 10th century were rare and precious objects, each one painstakingly copied by hand on expensive parchment. Athelstan gathered them with a fervour that made his court a centre of learning unmatched in Britain. Gospel books with painted illuminations, treatises on theology and history, scientific and medical texts. Works that had been lost in the chaos of the Viking invasions found new homes in the libraries Athelstan assembled. He himself was learned, able to read Latin fluently, personally engaged with the intellectual life of his court. Foreign scholars came to England knowing they would find a patron who valued their work. The king's household became a kind of academy, where the leading minds of the age gathered, discussed, and produced new works of scholarship. This was not the behaviour expected of a warrior king in the brutal world of the 10th century. But Athelstan was never content to be merely a warrior. He understood that power rested on legitimacy, that legitimacy required the Church's support, and that the Church valued learning and piety. His collections were expressions of genuine devotion, but they were also investments in the ideological foundations of his rule. Athelstan filled his churches with holy relics and his court with learned men. But he was not merely a collector of sacred objects. He was also a maker of sacred law. And the laws he created would shape English justice for centuries to come. No king before him had put so many words to parchment. Athelstan issued law code after law code, more than any Anglo-Saxon ruler who preceded him. Where other kings governed through custom and personal authority, Athelstan governed through written statutes that spelled out obligations, punishments, and procedures in exacting detail. He was not merely a conqueror who had seized a kingdom. He was a lawgiver who intended to reshape how that kingdom functioned. The most significant of these codes was issued at a great council held at Greatley, in Hampshire, sometime in the late 920s. The assembled nobles, bishops, and royal officials heard their king proclaim laws that would reach into every corner of English life. The code dealt extensively with theft, a crime that Athelstan pursued with particular intensity. A thief caught stealing goods worth more than 12 pence would face death. Those who sheltered thieves or failed to report them would face severe penalties of their own. The entire community was made responsible for policing itself. But the Greatley Code went far beyond theft. It established the death penalty for those who refused to pay their tithes to the church, binding religious obligation to royal enforcement. It created mechanisms for maintaining the fortifications, the berths, that were essential to the kingdom's defence, specifying how repairs would be organised and who would bear the costs. It regulated trade, requiring that all buying and selling of goods above a certain value take place in designated market towns, under the supervision of royal officials who could witness transactions and prevent the sale of stolen property. Other law codes followed greatly. At Exeter, Athelstan issued ordinances dealing with public order and the responsibilities of lords for the behaviour of their men. At Thunderfield, he proclaimed laws against the harbouring of criminals. At Faversham and at Whitby, further regulations extended the reach of royal justice into new territories and new aspects of daily life. The cumulative effect was revolutionary. For the first time, a comprehensive legal framework began to extend across all the English territories. A man in Northumbria was subject to the same basic laws as a man in Wessex. The king's peace was not merely a vague aspiration, but a concrete set of rules backed by specified punishments. The ancient patchwork of local customs and regional variations began to give way to something approaching a unified legal system. Athelstan did not impose these laws unilaterally. He understood that authority required consent, or at least the appearance of consent. He governed through councils, great assemblies where the leading men of the realm gathered to deliberate and advise. The bishops came, representing the church and bringing its moral authority. The ealdormen came, the royal officials who governed the shires and commanded local military forces. The king's thegns came, the warrior landholders whose loyalty was the bedrock of royal power. These councils met regularly throughout Athelstan's reign, in different locations across the kingdom. Their proceedings created a sense of shared investment in the decisions that emerged. The laws were not arbitrary commands from a distant tyrant. They were the agreed conclusions of the kingdom's collective leadership. Pronounced by the king but endorsed by his great men, through his laws and his councils, Athelstan bound his kingdom together with ties of obligation and justice. But beyond his borders, his enemies were watching, and in the cold northern lands of Scotland, a proud king was nursing a grievance that would eventually ignite the greatest conflict of the age. Constantine II had not forgotten his humiliation. The King of Scots was no young man nursing a fresh wound. He had already ruled for over 2 decades when he knelt before Athelstan at Eamont Bridge in 927. He had fought Vikings and Britons, navigated the treacherous politics of the northern kingdoms, and built a realm that stretched from the Forth to the distant Highlands. He was a survivor, a veteran, a king who understood patience as well as war. But submission burned in his memory. He had bent his knee to a younger man, a southerner, a king whose grandfather had been hiding in swamps when Constantine was already commanding armies. He had done it because he had no choice, because Athelstan's conquest of York had suddenly placed overwhelming English power on his southern border. It had been prudence, not loyalty. And prudence could be reconsidered when circumstances changed. The peace between England and Scotland was always fragile. Athelstan claimed overlordship, the right to interfere in Scottish affairs, the authority to demand obedience. Constantine chafed under these constraints. He was a king, not a vassal, and he had his own ambitions that did not include permanent subordination to the English crown. Tensions rose through the early 930s. The exact provocations are unclear in the sources, but Athelstan appears to have meddled in Scottish politics in ways that Constantine found intolerable. One account suggests that Athelstan harboured a Scottish prince with claims that threatened Constantine's line. Another implies disputes over the boundary between their realms, over the allegiance of lords in the contested borderlands. Whatever the specific grievances, the alliance forged at Eamont was crumbling. Constantine was too wise to challenge Athelstan alone. The English king commanded resources that Scotland could not match: a larger population, greater wealth, more warriors, the combined strength of Wessex and Mercia and the conquered Danelaw. A direct confrontation would end in disaster, but Constantine had other options. He had connections across the Irish Sea, relationships with the Viking lords who had been driven from York and who dreamed of reclaiming their lost kingdom. He had ties to the British kingdom of Strathclyde, whose rulers shared his resentment of English expansion. If enough enemies could be united, if enough swords could be gathered from enough corners of the British world, then perhaps Athelstan's power could be broken. Constantine had bowed before Athelstan once. He did not intend to bow again. Across the sea in Ireland, Viking kings were watching and waiting, and in the shadows a grand alliance was beginning to form, one that would unite every enemy Athelstan had made and march them south for one final reckoning. In the year 934, Athelstan struck first. The provocation had been too great to ignore. Constantine had broken faith, had violated the agreements made at Eamont, had begun to act as though English overlordship was a dead letter that could be disregarded. Athelstan decided that a reminder was necessary, not a gentle diplomatic message, but a demonstration of overwhelming force that would teach the Scottish king the price of defiance. The invasion was conducted on a scale that Britain had rarely seen. Athelstan marshalled not just an army but a fleet, coordinating land and sea forces in a campaign that would penetrate deeper into Scotland than any English king had ever ventured. The army marched north, crossing the old border and pushing into Constantine's territory. The ships sailed up the eastern coast, raiding and burning as they went. The targets were not random. The army advanced to Dunatar, a fortress perched on a rocky headland that was one of the most important strongholds in eastern Scotland. They reached Fordun, pressing beyond even that point into the heart of Constantine's realm. The fleet pushed even further, raiding as far north as Caithness, the distant territory at the very tip of the Scottish mainland. No corner of Constantine's kingdom was safe from English vengeance. This was not a war of conquest. Athelstan had no intention of occupying Scotland, of replacing Constantine with a puppet, of extending his administrative system into the Highlands and Islands. Such an undertaking would have stretched his resources impossibly thin and created problems far greater than it solved. This was a punitive expedition, designed to humiliate and to warn. Constantine could not resist. He lacked the strength to meet the English army in open battle, and he knew that defeat in the field would mean the end of his reign, and possibly his life. He was forced to watch as the invaders swept through his kingdom, burning and plundering, demonstrating with fire and sword that English power could reach anywhere. By autumn, Athelstan withdrew, his point made. Constantine still sat on his throne, but his prestige was shattered. He had been unable to protect his own lands from devastation. He had been exposed as too weak to challenge English might. But humiliation is not the same as submission. Constantine had been defeated, but he had not been destroyed. His hatred for Athelstan burned hotter than ever, and in the aftermath of the invasion, as he surveyed the damage and counted his losses, he began to plan. Not another futile resistance, not a lone stand against impossible odds, but something far more ambitious. He would build an alliance that could actually win. Athelstan returned from Scotland victorious. He had reminded Constantine of the price of defiance, but he had also made a mortal enemy. In the years that followed, Constantine would weave together an alliance of unprecedented scale, Vikings, Scots and Britons united by a single purpose, the destruction of the English king. The messengers travelled in secret, across the Irish Sea to Dublin, where the Vikings nursed their own grievances, south to Strathclyde, where a British kingdom clung to independence between the English and the Scots, perhaps even to Wales, where princes who had submitted to Athelstan might be persuaded to reconsider their loyalties. Constantine was building something that had never been attempted before, a coalition of all of Athelstan's enemies, united by nothing except their shared hatred of English dominance. The key to the alliance was Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king of Dublin. Olaf had never forgotten York. His father Guthfrith had been driven from that city when Athelstan seized it in 927. The kingdom of Northumbria, which his family had ruled, had been stolen by the English king. Olaf had grown to manhood in Dublin, dreaming of revenge, building his power among the Irish Vikings, waiting for the day when he could reclaim his inheritance. Dublin in the 930s was one of the great Viking strongholds of the Western world. Its harbour sheltered a fleet of longships. Its warriors were veterans of countless raids and battles across Ireland and beyond. Olaf commanded resources that made him a power in his own right, capable of projecting force across the Irish Sea. He was exactly the ally Constantine needed. The negotiations must have been complex. Constantine was a Christian king. Olaf came from a world that still mixed Christianity with older Norse beliefs. Constantine ruled a settled agricultural kingdom. Olaf commanded warriors more comfortable on ships than in fields. Their interests overlapped only in their enmity toward Athelstan, but that enmity was enough. By 936 or 937, the alliance was complete. Olaf would sail from Dublin with his fleet and his army. Constantine would march south with the host of Scotland. Owen, king of Strathclyde, would join them with his British warriors. Together they would form the largest military force to invade England since the great heathen army had landed 3 generations earlier. The strategic concept was simple. Athelstan could not be everywhere. If enough enemies struck simultaneously from enough directions, his defences would crack. Even if he managed to concentrate his forces against one threat, the others would ravage his kingdom while his attention was diverted. The alliance would crush him through sheer weight of numbers and coordination. This was not a raid or a border skirmish. This was an existential conflict, a war that would determine whether Athelstan's unified England would survive or be torn apart into its constituent pieces. The allies understood the stakes. They were wagering everything on a single throw. In the summer of 937, the great fleet of Olaf Guthfrithson sailed from Dublin. Constantine marched his Scottish host south. Owen led the men of Strathclyde. From across the Irish Sea and from beyond the Forth, they converged on English soil. The largest invasion force Britain had seen since the great heathen army was coming for Athelstan. Everything he had built would be decided by a single battle. They came like a flood. The Viking fleet crossed the Irish Sea, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors. They made landfall somewhere on the western coast of Britain, perhaps in the Wirral Peninsula, perhaps further north. The exact location is one of history's great mysteries, argued over by scholars for centuries. What is certain is that Olaf's army linked up with Constantine's Scots and Owen's Strathclyde Britons, creating a combined force of staggering size. The coalition pushed inland. Town after town, village after village, the invaders advanced into the heart of England. Whether they met serious resistance along the way, whether local lords tried to slow their progress or simply fled before the storm, the sources do not say. What they record is that a vast hostile army was loose in Athelstan's kingdom, and the king would have to stop it or watch everything he had built collapse. Athelstan summoned the Fyrd. Across England, the ancient system of military obligation came to life. Every free man owed service to his king in times of crisis. The elder men of the shires gathered their contingents. The thegns rode in with their households. From Wessex and Mercia and the conquered Danelaw, the warriors of England assembled. This was not a professional army in the modern sense, but it was a formidable force of men who trained regularly for war and who understood that defeat would mean the destruction of their homes and families. At Athelstan's side was his half-brother Edmund, still a teenager but old enough to fight. Edmund had grown up in a court that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. He had trained with weapons since childhood. Now he would prove himself in the greatest battle of the age. The two armies manoeuvred across the landscape, each seeking advantage. The coalition likely held the initiative at first, choosing where to strike and when. But Athelstan was closing in, bringing the combined strength of England to bear. Somewhere, at some point, the two forces would meet. The ground they chose would become the most famous battlefield in Anglo-Saxon history. We call it Brunanburh, but we do not know where it was. The name appears in the chronicles celebrated in verse and prose, but its location has been lost to time. Scholars have proposed sites across northern England, in the Wirral, in Yorkshire, in Lancashire, in Northumbria. Each candidate has its advocates, each its problems. The battlefield where England's fate was decided has vanished from the map, swallowed by 1,000 years of changing names and forgotten landmarks. What we know is that both armies were vast, that both were confident, and that both understood the stakes. There would be no negotiated peace, no last-minute compromise. This would be settled in blood. Two vast armies moved across the landscape, each seeking the ground that would give them advantage. When they finally met, the sun had not yet risen. In the grey light of dawn, the greatest battle in Anglo-Saxon history was about to begin. The fighting began before sunrise and did not end until darkness made it impossible to continue. In the grey half-light of dawn, the two armies faced each other across the field that would give its name to legend. On one side stood Athelstan and Edmund with the warriors of England. On the other stood Olaf and Constantine and Owen with the combined might of the Viking, Scottish and British alliance. The chronicles do not give us precise numbers, but both forces were enormous by the standards of the age. This was not a skirmish between raiding parties. This was a clash of nations. The battle opened in the Anglo-Saxon manner, with the formation of the shield wall. Warriors locked their round wooden shields together, creating a barrier of wood and iron. Behind this wall, spears thrust forward, seeking gaps in the enemy's defence. Axes rose and fell, swords hacked at arms and legs. The front ranks absorbed terrible punishment, while the rear ranks pressed forward, adding their weight to the crush. Shield wall met shield wall, and the killing began. The sources describe a day of unrelenting brutality. There were no clever tactical manoeuvres, no flanking movements that decided the issue in an hour. This was grinding, exhausting, face-to-face combat that lasted from dawn until dusk. Men fought until their arms could no longer lift their weapons, until the ground beneath their feet turned to mud mixed with blood, until the corpses piled so high that the living had to climb over the dead to reach their enemies. Athelstan and Edmund were in the thick of it. Anglo-Saxon kings did not command from the rear. They led from the front, their presence stiffening the resolve of their warriors, their personal courage setting the example. The risk was enormous. If the king fell, the battle was lost. But the reward was the loyalty of men who knew their lord shared their danger. As the hours passed, the coalition began to break. The ferocity of the English resistance was more than they had anticipated. The shield wall held. The warriors of Wessex and Mercia, fighting for their homes and families, would not yield. The casualties among the Allied leadership were catastrophic. 5 kings fell on the field, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. 7 earls died beside them. Constantine's own son was among the dead, a loss that would haunt the Scottish king for the rest of his days. The Viking jarls who had sailed from Dublin expecting plunder and glory found instead a slaughter beyond imagining. By nightfall, the coalition army was broken. Those who could flee did so. Olaf Guthfrithson fought his way back to his ships and escaped across the Irish Sea to Dublin, his dreams of reconquering York drowned in English blood. Constantine retreated northward with the remnants of his army, a shattered old man who had gambled everything and lost. Owen of Strathclyde led his surviving Britons back to their homeland in the west. The field belonged to Athelstan. The dead lay thick upon the ground, so numerous that the chroniclers resorted to poetry to capture the scale of the carnage. The ravens and the eagles feasted, the wolves howled over the fallen. It was the greatest slaughter that Britain had witnessed since the legions of Rome had departed 5 centuries before. As the sun set over Brunanburh, Athelstan had won the most complete military victory any English king had ever achieved. His enemies were broken, scattered, fleeing for their lives. But the chroniclers who recorded his triumph did more than simply note his victory. They composed a poem, one that would preserve the glory of this day for more than 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was usually a dry document. Year after year, the monks who kept it recorded the events of their time in terse, factual prose. Battles were noted. Kings died. Bishops were appointed. The entries rarely exceeded a few sentences, offering bare facts without embellishment or emotion. But for the year 937, the chronicle erupted into poetry. The entry for Brunanburh is not a chronicle entry at all. It is a heroic poem, 73 lines of Old English verse celebrating the victory in language that would not be equalled until the great epics of later centuries. The monks who recorded history had recognised that this was not an ordinary event. This demanded commemoration in the highest literary form their culture possessed. The poem opens with thunder. Athelstan, lord of warriors, ring-giver of men, and his brother Edmund struck the enemy at Brunanburh. They split the shield wall, hewed the battle linden with hammered swords. They were sons of Edward, as was fitting for their noble line, that they should defend their land, their hoards, and their homes against every foe. The verses roll forward with savage exultation. The enemy fell, the Scots and the shipmen fell death-doomed. The field grew dark with the blood of men. 5 young kings lay dead on the battlefield, put to sleep by swords. 7 of Olaf's earls died, and countless of his sailors and soldiers. Constantine is mocked with bitter satisfaction. The old warrior had no cause to exult in that clash of blades. He had lost his kinsmen in the conflict, his friends on the field. He left his son on the place of slaughter, a young man mangled by wounds. The grey-haired warrior, the old trickster, had no reason to boast. The poem reaches back into history to emphasise the magnitude of the achievement. Never before, the poet declares, was there greater slaughter on this island, never more men felled by the edge of the sword, not since the Angles and Saxons first came over the sea, seeking Britain and conquering the Welsh. This was not merely propaganda, though propaganda it certainly was. The poem captured something real about how contemporaries understood the significance of Brunanburh. This was the battle that secured England. This was the day when all the enemies who might have unmade Athelstan's kingdom had tried their strength and failed. The coalition represented the last best hope of those who resisted English unification. Its destruction meant that the idea of England could no longer be reversed by force. The poem survived because it deserved to survive. It is one of the finest pieces of Old English literature that has come down to us, standing alongside Beowulf in the canon of Anglo-Saxon poetry. Scholars still study its metre, its imagery, its cultural assumptions. It remains, after more than 1,000 years, a living document of a vanished world. The poet sang of Athelstan's glory. His enemies were defeated, his kingdom secure, his legacy seemingly assured. But the king who had achieved so much was not destined to enjoy his triumph for long. Within 2 years of his greatest victory he would be dead. The broken kings limped home to count their losses. Constantine returned to Scotland a diminished man. He had staked everything on the alliance, had risked his kingdom and his family for the chance to break English power, and he had lost catastrophically. His son lay dead at Brunanburh. His army was shattered. His prestige, built over decades of careful rule, had been destroyed in a single day. Within a few years he would abdicate his throne and retire to a monastery, spending his final years in prayer and penance. The old warrior who had defied Athelstan ended his days as a monk. Olaf Guthfrithson escaped to Dublin with enough men to maintain his position among the Irish Vikings, but his dreams of conquering York had turned to ashes. He would rebuild his strength in the years to come, waiting for another opportunity. But that opportunity would not come while Athelstan lived. Owen of Strathclyde returned to his small kingdom in the west, his realm intact, but his ambitions chastened. The British enclave that had survived between the expanding powers of Scotland and England would continue its precarious existence, but it would not again challenge English supremacy. The Welsh princes, whatever encouragement they might have given to the coalition, hastened to renew their submissions to Athelstan. They had seen what happened to those who defied the English king. They had no desire to share Constantine's fate. For Athelstan, Brunanburh was the culmination of everything his family had worked toward for 3 generations. His grandfather Alfred had saved Wessex from destruction and dreamed of uniting the English. His father Edward had conquered the Danelaw and absorbed Mercia. Now Athelstan had defeated the last great coalition that might have reversed those achievements. The enemies were broken. The kingdom was secure. The dream had become reality. England existed, not just as a geographical expression or a collection of territories under a single ruler, but as a political fact that could no longer be challenged by force. The battles that followed in later reigns would be struggles for control of an existing kingdom, not attempts to unmake the kingdom itself. The fundamental question, whether there would be an England at all, had been answered at Brunanburh. Athelstan returned to his kingdom in triumph. His court glittered with the attention of foreign princes. His churches overflowed with the relics he'd collected. His laws governed a realm that stretched from the Channel to the Scottish border. He was perhaps 43 years old, in the prime of life for a medieval king who had survived the dangers of battle and disease. Athelstan returned to his kingdom as the undisputed master of Britain. He had conquered every enemy, built alliances across Europe, and created laws that would outlive him by centuries. He was perhaps 43 years old. and he had less than 2 years left to live. The chronicles grow quiet after Brunanburh. The great victory of 937 dominates the sources with its poetry and its drama. But the 2 years that followed are nearly blank. No major campaigns are recorded. No significant law codes survive from these final years. No treaties, no submissions, no dramatic confrontations with foreign powers. It is as if Athelstan, having achieved everything, simply governed. Perhaps this silence reflects the mundane reality of successful kingship. The wars had been won, the enemies had been crushed. What remained was the unglamorous work of administration, settling disputes, collecting taxes, maintaining fortifications, ensuring that the great machine of the kingdom continued to function. Such work does not make for exciting chronicle entries, or perhaps the silence reflects something else. Perhaps Athelstan's health was already failing. He had lived a hard life, campaigning in Scotland, fighting at Brunanburh, bearing the constant stress of ruling a kingdom surrounded by enemies. Medieval kings aged quickly. A man of 44 in the 10th century had lived longer than most of his subjects would ever live. What we know is that Athelstan continued to be king. He continued to grant lands and privileges, as the surviving charters attest. He continued to patronise the monasteries and churches that had supported his rule. He continued to collect the relics and manuscripts that were his passion. If he sensed that his end was approaching, he left no record of it. His half-brother Edmund was now a young man in his late teens, proven in battle at Brunanburh, clearly being prepared for the succession that must eventually come. Athelstan had never married, had never produced an heir of his body. The crown would pass to Edmund, and after Edmund to their younger brother Edred. The dynasty would continue even if Athelstan's personal line did not. The summer of 939 passed. Autumn came, with its shortening days and cooling temperatures. Athelstan was at Gloucester, the old Roman city in the west of his kingdom, when illness struck. The sources do not describe his symptoms. They do not tell us whether he suffered briefly or lingered for weeks. They tell us only the ending. In the autumn of 939, the king who had forged England fell ill. He had never married, never produced an heir. The crown he had worn with such distinction would pass to his half-brother Edmund, still a young man barely out of his teens. The first king of England was dying. On the 27th of October, in the year 939, Athelstan died. He was approximately 45 years old. He had reigned as king for 14 years, longer than his father and nearly as long as his grandfather. He had united the English kingdoms, conquered Northumbria, received the submission of every ruler in Britain, built alliances that stretched across Europe, issued more laws than any previous king, collected more relics than any church, and won the greatest military victory in Anglo-Saxon history. And now he was gone. The death occurred at Gloucester, in the heart of the old Mercian lands where he had spent his formative years. Perhaps there was something fitting in that. He had been raised among the Mercians, had learned to rule in their halls, had built his power on the loyalty of their nobles. He died among them, far from the ancestral West Saxon heartland where his dynasty had originated. His final wishes were unusual. The kings of his line were buried at Winchester, the royal mausoleum where Alfred and Edward lay in their tombs. But Athelstan wanted something different. He asked to be buried at Malmesbury Abbey, the ancient monastery in Wiltshire that he had patronised throughout his reign. He had given the monks lands and treasures. He had donated relics of extraordinary value. He had formed a bond with the community that he wished to continue beyond death. The monks of Malmesbury received his body with honour. They prepared it for burial according to the rites of the church, commending his soul to God. They interred him in a place of distinction within their abbey, marking the spot where England's first king would rest for eternity. He was the only medieval English king to die unmarried and without children. He was the only one to be buried at Malmesbury rather than Winchester or Westminster. Even in death, he stood apart, unique among the rulers of his nation. His half-brother Edmund, now 18 years old, received word of Athelstan's death and assumed the crown. The transition was smooth. There were no succession disputes, no rival claimants, no civil wars. Athelstan's careful arrangements had ensured that power would pass peacefully to the next generation. But Edmund would soon discover that his brother's achievements were easier to inherit than to maintain. The enemies Athelstan had defeated were not as destroyed as they had appeared. The kingdom he had built would face new challenges before it was truly secure. Athelstan was laid to rest at Malmesbury, far from the ancestral tombs of his dynasty. His half-brother Edmund, who had fought beside him at Brunanburh, was now king. But Edmund would soon learn that holding England together was far harder than forging it, and that the enemies Athelstan had defeated were not as broken as they had appeared. The abbey had stood for centuries before Athelstan was born, and it would stand for centuries after he died. Malmesbury was one of the oldest monastic foundations in England, tracing its origins back to the 7th century, when an Irish monk named Maildulf had established a hermitage in the Wiltshire countryside. Over the generations, it had grown into one of the great centres of learning and piety in the English Church. Its library held treasures of scholarship. Its monks were renowned for their education and their devotion. It was exactly the kind of place that would appeal to a king who collected books as eagerly as he collected relics. Athelstan had been a generous patron throughout his reign. He had given the abbey lands that produced steady income. He had donated precious manuscripts to its library. Most importantly, he had showered it with holy relics of extraordinary value. The monks of Malmesbury possessed fragments of the true cross, bones of apostles and martyrs, sacred objects that drew pilgrims from across the kingdom. Many of these treasures had come directly from the king's own collection, transferred to the monastery as gifts of pious devotion. In return, the monks remembered him. They prayed for his soul daily, as they had promised to do. They maintained his tomb as a site of veneration. They preserved the stories of his deeds, passing them down through generations of the community. Long after other memories of Athelstan had faded, Malmesbury kept his legacy alive. 2 centuries later, this preservation bore remarkable fruit. A monk named William, born in the abbey and educated in its traditions, decided to write a comprehensive history of the English kings. William of Malmesbury, as he came to be known, was one of the finest historians of the medieval period, careful with his sources, sceptical of legends, yet willing to record the traditions that had been passed down in his community. When William came to write about Athelstan, he had access to memories that existed nowhere else. The stories of the Golden Sword ceremony, the details of Athelstan's appearance and character, the accounts of his piety and his learning, all of these came from traditions preserved at Malmesbury across 200 years. Without William's history, we would know Athelstan only as a name in the chronicles. Because of him, we know Athelstan as a man. The king who had united England chose to spend eternity not among warriors, but among scholars. His tomb at Malmesbury was a statement of values, a final declaration of what he believed mattered most. Athelstan rested at Malmesbury, but his kingdom did not rest with him. Within weeks of his death, Olaf Guthfrithson sailed from Dublin with a fresh army. He recaptured York and much of the Midlands. Edmund struggled to hold what his brother had built. The unity that Athelstan had forged would be tested again and again in the years to come. The vultures descended before the grave was cold. Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king who had fled Brunanburh with his shattered army just 2 years earlier, saw his opportunity. Athelstan was dead. A teenager sat on the English throne. The great king who had seemed invincible was gone, and his successors were untested. Olaf gathered his forces in Dublin, crossed the Irish Sea, and invaded. The campaign was devastatingly successful. York fell back into Viking hands almost immediately. The Norse population of Northumbria, never fully reconciled to English rule, welcomed their returning lords. Olaf pushed south, raiding deep into the Midlands, reclaiming territories that Athelstan had spent years conquering. By the end of 940 it seemed possible that Athelstan's entire achievement might unravel. Edmund fought back, but he was 18 years old and facing a veteran warlord with momentum on his side. The best the young king could manage was a negotiated partition. The Treaty of Leicester in 940 divided England, ceding much of the eastern Midlands to Viking control. It was a humiliating setback that would have been unthinkable while Athelstan lived. But England did not break. Edmund was young, but he was capable, and he was patient. When Olaf died in 941, succeeded by his cousin Olaf Sistriksson, the new Viking king proved less formidable. Edmund launched a counter-offensive. By 944 he had recovered the lost territories. By 945, Northumbria itself was back under English control. The kingdom was whole again. Edmund's own reign ended violently in 946, when he was stabbed to death while trying to protect his steward from an outlaw at a feast. He was only 25 years old. The crown passed to his younger brother Edred, who faced yet another Viking resurgence in Northumbria. Edred suppressed it with brutal efficiency, devastating the north so thoroughly that resistance finally collapsed. By the time of his death in 955, Northumbria was permanently incorporated into the English kingdom. The next generation brought stability at last. Edgar, Edmund's son, inherited a peaceful and prosperous realm. His reign, from 959 to 975, was so tranquil that later generations called him Edgar the Peaceful. The administrative structures that Athelstan had created functioned smoothly. The legal frameworks he had established continued to govern. The unified kingdom he had forged had become permanent. Athelstan's brothers and nephews finished what he started. The kingdom he forged survived Viking resurgence, civil war and foreign conquest. But strangely, as the centuries passed, the man who had created England began to fade from memory. His successors grew famous while he was forgotten. History has a way of playing favourites, and Athelstan was not among the chosen. His grandfather Alfred became the Great, the only English monarch to bear that title. Celebrated in chronicles and legends, his memory kept alive by the church he had patronised and the scholars he had inspired. The story of Alfred hiding in the marshes, burning the cakes, emerging to save his kingdom from destruction, became one of the founding myths of English identity. Every schoolchild learned his name, but Athelstan, who completed what Alfred had only begun, who achieved what Alfred could only dream of, faded into obscurity. The reasons are not difficult to understand once you examine them. First, he had no descendants to remember him. Alfred's line continued through Edward and through Athelstan's half-brothers, but Athelstan himself left no children. There were no sons to commission chronicles celebrating their father's deeds, no daughters to endow monasteries in his memory. His legacy had no direct inheritors with personal stakes in preserving it. Second, he was overshadowed by the drama that came after. The Norman conquest of 1066 created a fault line in English history. Everything before that date became the dim past, an age of Anglo-Saxon kings whose names blurred together in the minds of later generations. The new Norman rulers had no interest in celebrating their predecessors. They wanted to emphasize their own legitimacy, not the achievements of the dynasty they had displaced. Third, even the site of his greatest triumph was lost. Brunanburh, the battle that secured England's existence, cannot be located on any modern map. Scholars have proposed dozens of candidates across northern England, but none can be confirmed. The battlefield where Athelstan won his most famous victory has vanished. taking with it the possibility of a memorial site, a place of pilgrimage, a physical reminder of what he accomplished. Fourth, Athelstan lacked the romantic drama that makes historical figures memorable. He was not martyred like Edmund of East Anglia. He did not have the tragic fall of Harold at Hastings. He did not display the colourful tyranny of later kings or the passionate conflicts that fill the chronicles of medieval England. He was effective, competent, successful, and therefore somehow less interesting to later storytellers than kings who failed spectacularly. The result is a strange injustice. The man who created England is nearly unknown in England. The battle that saved the nation cannot be found. The tomb that holds his remains is visited by a handful of tourists each year, most of whom have only the vaguest idea of who lies beneath the stone. Yet though his name faded, his work did not. Every time we speak of England, every time we think of it as a single nation with a single identity, we are living in the world that Athelstan created. What Athelstan built has outlasted everything else from his age. The kingdoms he conquered no longer exist. Wessex is a historical memory. Mercia is a name on old maps. The Viking realm of York has vanished entirely, leaving only archaeological traces beneath the streets of a modern city. The dynasties he allied with have risen and fallen. The Carolingians collapsed. The Ottonian emperors he was related to by marriage have been succeeded by centuries of different rulers. The very languages spoken in his time have evolved beyond recognition. But England remains. The nation Athelstan created has survived for more than 1,000 years. It has endured Viking resurgence and Norman conquest and civil war and reformation and revolution and world wars. Its boundaries have shifted. Its government has transformed. Its society has changed beyond anything a 10th century king could have imagined. Yet the fundamental idea that there is a place called England and a people called the English has persisted without interruption from Athelstan's time to our own. His administrative innovations endured as well. The system of shires governed by royal officials, the network of courts and councils, the mechanisms for collecting taxes and enforcing law, all of these survived his death and continued to develop over the following centuries. When William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, he did not dismantle the English administrative system. He took it over and used it because it worked. Athelstan's structures proved so effective that foreign conquerors found them worth preserving. His diplomatic marriages bore fruit he never lived to see. His half-sister Edgifu, grandmother to Hugh Capet, connected the English royal line to the dynasty that would rule France for 8 centuries. His half-sister Edgith, wife of Otto the Great, became Holy Roman Empress. English blood flowed into the royal houses of Europe, a legacy of Athelstan's careful alliance building. His legal principles influenced the development of English common law, the emphasis on written codes, on witnesses to transactions, on royal responsibility for maintaining peace and justice. All of these concepts that Athelstan championed became foundational elements of the English legal tradition. When later jurists spoke of ancient liberties and the rights of Englishmen, they were building on foundations that Athelstan had helped to lay. Most importantly, he proved that a unified England was possible. Before Athelstan, the English kingdoms had been rivals, often at war, never truly united. After Athelstan, division was always temporary, always followed by reunification. The idea that England should be one kingdom became so deeply embedded that even the most devastating setbacks could not permanently undo it. Athelstan's story is one of the great unsung epics of English history, a tale of a questionable prince who became the architect of a nation. If this journey into the past has meant something to you, I hope you will take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Your support makes these explorations possible, and it truly means a great deal to me. The first King of England lies at Malmesbury still, or what remains of him. after centuries of neglect and reformation. His tomb was lost, rediscovered, and now sits in the abbey as a reminder of a man who deserves to be remembered. We began this journey in the chaos of a shattered island. The Britain of the 9th century was a world of fire and blood, of burning monasteries and fleeing refugees, of Viking longships appearing on the horizon and kingdoms falling one by one. It was a world where the very survival of the English people seemed doubtful, where the idea that they might one day unite into a single nation would have seemed like fantasy. From that chaos emerged a dynasty. Alfred hiding in the swamps, refusing to surrender, rebuilding his kingdom stone by stone. Edward relentlessly conquering, pushing the boundaries ever outward. And finally Athelstan, the grandson born under a shadow, raised in a foreign court, questioned and doubted throughout his life, who nevertheless rose to become the first king of all England. His achievement was not inevitable. At every stage it could have failed. If Alfred had died in the marshes, if Edward's conquests had faltered, if Athelstan had been pushed aside by his more legitimate half-brothers, if the alliance at Brunanburh had succeeded. History turns on contingencies, on moments when everything hangs in the balance and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. But Athelstan did not fail. He united the kingdoms, he defeated his enemies, he built institutions that outlasted him, he created a nation that still exists, more than 1,000 years after his death, still bearing the name he gave it. He was not perfect. He could be ruthless, as his treatment of his rivals showed. He could be proud, as his grandiose title suggested. He made enemies who would trouble his successors long after he was gone. But he was also learned and pious, a collector of books and relics, a king who valued scholarship as well as warfare. He was a lawgiver who tried to bring justice to his kingdom. He was a statesman who understood that power required more than force. Most of all, he was successful. In an age when kings were measured by what they conquered and what they held, Athelstan conquered more and held more than any English king before him. He earned his place in history, even if history has largely forgotten to remember him. Perhaps that will change. Perhaps the first king of England will one day receive the recognition he deserves, will take his place alongside Alfred in the national memory, will be celebrated as the founder he truly was. Or perhaps he will remain in the shadows, known only to those who seek him out, a secret king whose story rewards those patient enough to learn it. Either way, his work endures, England endures, and that, in the end, is the only legacy that truly matters. And so we reach the end of our journey through the life of Athelstan, the first king of England. It has been my honour to be your guide. Thank you for listening. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.